Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. We spend a lot of time on the podcast talking about the pillars of effective leadership and how leaders should lead with servant leadership criteria in mind, particularly in school systems. There's always an opportunity, though, to delve further into these topics. One area that deserves attention is how we ground any school improvement work we do, especially as leaders, around what the data is telling us about our school communities. I'm really excited to have as my guest today, Chad Dumas, who is founder and CEO of Next Learning Solutions. He is also a former principal and author of 3 books. 2 of those books are on how schools should run PLCs, and of course, data plays a big part in that. And his new book coming out, which is called Teacher Team Leaders, Simple Habits to Transform Collaboration. Chad, thank you so much for being here tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Chad, how did data or the use of data in school improvement planning become an area of interest of yours as an education management professional?
For me, data became really important early on in my career. I think maybe even my first or second year when I was tasked with leading the school improvement committee at the middle school that I was a teacher at. Went to some trainings and workshops and really saw the power of data to inform our practice. Early on, I just saw how powerful data can be to help set goals and then to track and monitor those goals to make sure that you're making progress. Without knowing that you're getting better, momentum dies really quickly. And so we have to be able to know that we're getting better, not only to be able to celebrate what we're doing well, but also to be able to make course corrections in real time early on without waiting 5 years to determine whether or not something has worked or not.
You actually foreshadowed my next question, which is I look at data to form your school improvement plans. What I like to say to those that I work with and the folks that I coach, Chad, is to use an example from the medical field. People can have fevers for many reasons. You could have a fever of 100 degrees. I could have a fever of 100 degrees. So we both have a fever that requires attention, but yet the causes of your fever and your infection might be different than mine. So we need in the medical space to have data around what is causing each of our fevers. You could almost use a similar, I guess it's an analogy in the education space in saying, well, we need to diagnose the causes of why our schools might not be performing as well as we want them to perform. Chad, how would you, and you've already started talking about this, talking about how data should inform improvement plans because it really tells us what we should be focusing on. What are some other ways, though, or other reasons, I should say, why we should be using data in our school improvement work? And what are the kinds of data we should be using in this regard?
So in terms of what data does, and then we'll start there and then go into, okay, so what kinds of data? What data does is give us mile markers to tell us that we're on the right path to where we're going. The goals tell us where we're going, and then they mark that out so we can celebrate and make course corrections. And I sometimes like to use an analogy of travel. If I'm taking my family on a vacation, we decide where we're going. I live in central Iowa. If I'm going to go to Chicago and take my family to Chicago for vacation, that's the goal. And then we've got data, mile markers that let us know. So we're going to look at the highway signs, We're going to look at how much gas is in the gas tank of the vehicle, or we're going to decide whether we're going to fly, hike, or walk. And so all these decisions are informed by the data. How long do we want to be there? And then help us to inform our route on our way there. Like I said, I'm in central Iowa and I'm going to Chicago. And if I find myself going west on Interstate 80, I want to make that course correction before I get to Omaha, which is out of the way. So that data helps to form that. Setting those goals and then giving us that real-time information is the power of data. And then in terms of what data should we be using, I was trained in the Susan Brookhart frame of looking at data with the 4 lenses. When we're looking at school improvement comprehensively and setting that big goal of 3 to 5 years out, we want to take a comprehensive look at our data. And so we look at those 4 lenses: achievement, perception, program, and demographic data. Through those 4 lenses, then we get a complete picture. Many times in schools, we look at those 4 different types of data, but we look at them in isolation from each other, as opposed to looking at them together and saying, okay, how is our perception data impacting our achievement data and vice versa? And our program data impacting both of those, and our demographic data, who we are. And demographic data beyond simply race and ethnicity, but who are we as student, staff, and community? Taking that comprehensive look to set the goals, and then we can talk a little bit more about the real-time data, but those would be the big overarching lenses through which the data, I think, it's helpful to look at.
You already framed some of the demographic data that schools should be looking at to get a sense of who they are. In terms of the other 3 lenses of looking at data, can you give some examples of what type of data folks might be or leaders might want to look at in each of those domains?
Absolutely. Starting with achievement data, the question that achievement data answers is, how are we doing? And so each of these types of data answers a question. And so achievement is, how are we doing? And so that's things like state test scores, end of course exams, ACT results, SAT results, college and career, all of those achievement type scores. So that's how we're doing. Perception data is, how do we feel we're doing? That is many times thought of as surveys. We survey our parents, we survey our students, we survey our staff. And there's some other very interesting perception data that people don't typically think of. For example, attendance data can say a lot about how people feel about the organization. If they don't want to be there every day, they're not going to be there. They're going to struggle. And so attendance data can be a source of perception data. Behavioral office referral data can be perceptual type data. Behavior communicates. And so when kids communicate to us through misbehavior, that's telling us something about their sense of belonging, their sense of value, their sense of how important the content is, depending on where those referrals are coming from. Demographic data answers the question, who are we? Who are the kids? Who are the staff? Who's the community? Many times we think of it in terms of race and ethnicity, and it goes beyond that. Socioeconomics, narrative descriptions of who we are, the types of businesses in our community, how they support the school, how the school supports the community. So lots of different ways of thinking about demographics. And then program data answers the question of, what do we do? Things like, what are the number of students who are identified in gifted programs and special ed programs, the number of AP courses that we offer, the number of clubs and after school activities that students participate in, the number of extracurriculars and who participate. So these are all the different programs that schools offer. You look at all those, you get a comprehensive look at, who are we? What do we believe, or how do we feel about ourselves? What do we offer, and how are we doing?
Exactly. I loved how you talked about how data answers questions, because one thing I find in my coaching is it's very easy for people to get overwhelmed by the amount of data, especially in
Yes.
schools that our schools receive. And so there's almost a counter effect. As an industry or as a field, central office at the state level, they want to give schools data so schools can act on that data. But again, sometimes it's so much data that on the school level, there's a lack of an awareness of which data they should be looking at, when they should be looking at it. And I often tell folks that a lot of the data is duplicate. You want to focus on a question that data can help you find the answer to. And once you know what the question is that you're asking about where your school is or how it's performing or how it might perform in the future, once you know what your grounding question is, Then as a community, whether that's your school leadership team or your PLCs, can then start going, okay, so now that we know the question, which data sources will help us answer which questions? That I find sometimes relieves pressure that I know leaders feel in understanding data. So again, I'm glad that you mentioned having those key questions in mind as a starting point for deciding how to use data to improve. Where would you put, because we talked a lot in that last question, and you talked a lot about looking at achievement data, and you spent a fair amount of time in some good examples talking about student data. What kind of teacher data might we be looking at to determine where we are in terms of our academic performance? And where within the 4Cs would you put that sort of data?
I love this whole conversation because it's really interesting. It threw me back. And I was working with a high school principal in a small district, maybe 250, 300 students, grades 7 through 12. He said, Chad, in our school, we have data RIA. Years later, we still have data RIA in a lot of schools, right? We got so much data, we don't know what to do with it. And so really refining in our practice on what data are we looking at, I think is really key, just like you said. What are we going after? And most of the data sources that district offices and the state offices provide is not helpful day to day. That helps you say we're going to Chicago, but it doesn't help you when you're trying to get onto the interstate right outside of Des Moines and you've got 250 miles yet to go. That doesn't help you there. What helps you is what you were raising, this teacher and student level data day to day. And so, as you mentioned, they do a lot of work in the PLC and the PLC at Work. And with Solution Tree, I'm blessed to be an associate for the PLC at Work stuff. What we find is that the most impactful data is that data that's close to the classroom in those common formative assessments, or if you are a singleton in those formative assessments where you're looking at strategically and intentionally how kids are doing on very discrete small chunks of content so that we can change our practice real time. For instance, if I'm teaching kids in second grade how to add and subtract, add 4-digit numbers and subtract 2-digit numbers using multiple strategies and the standard algorithm, if I wait 3 weeks to the end of the unit to find out how kids are doing on just adding 2-digit numbers, not even 4-digit numbers, that's too long. I got to find out how are kids doing on adding 2-digit numbers before I can then get to 3-digit numbers and then 4-digit numbers using the standard algorithm, or maybe using a number line, or maybe using regrouping or whatever strategy that I'm using. I'm getting in those small little chunks to make those changes. And that is data. And sometimes the data is as simple as kids have an exit ticket. They have a 3x5 note card. And before they leave to go out to morning recess, they all answer one question that's up on the board. And then as a teacher, I take a look at those, filter it. These kids got it. These kids have this misconception. These kids have this misconception. And my data is those 3 stacks of note cards. And now I respond now in the moment. So that's the powerful teacher data. And then for the school level is looking at, okay, so how many of our teachers are doing that? How many of our teams are doing that collectively? What are they doing to respond to that? How frequently are we engaging that? What are the results of the kids' performance after they engage in that process? And then at the end of the unit assessment. So there's alignment. The building principal isn't looking at different data from what the teachers, but what the teachers are doing is what the principal is looking at. And then, of course, the central office, we want that to be the same way. The central office is looking at how is the school building administrators or school leaders looking at and supporting teacher teams in doing that work. So there's that alignment from the boardroom to the classroom, if you will.
And that is so true. And I believe that what you really hit on is important, that alignment. And there's a reason we call this teaching and learning. Yes, it's about what the students are learning, but it's also about how teachers are teaching. And to your point about exit tickets, and Chad, I wouldn't have a job if I didn't coach people on exit tickets. I think that's about a quarter of my consulting practice right there, how to use those formative assessment strategies. But again, all right, so the student completed a exit ticket. Now, as teachers, how do you use that data, because that is data, in the moment live data, to plan that next lesson? To your point, not waiting for the end of the unit, but how are you going to use that the next day? And or how might you bring those exit tickets to your PLC meeting and
Hmm.
then look at, all right, well, where did our students do well at in this particular
Yep.
exit ticket? And where are those
Yep.
opportunities for growth? And how are we going to help our students excel in that
Hmm.
area where they have yet to excel, where they have yet to be proficient? What
Yep.
scaffolds, what supports, and quite frankly, in some situations, what extensions, if our students
Hmm.
have
Yep.
met the goal, are we going to employ for the students who can grow at an even faster pace? So it's about student data, but it's also about how teachers use that data. Some of the practices I suggest, Chad, when I work with teacher teams, is looking at student work, doing intervisitations, doing Japanese lesson study, maybe even doing a problem of practice or a
Hmm.
fishbowl type activity
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
a teacher shares, hey, this is what's going on in my classroom. How do others think I might want to solve that? Now, that might be more qualitative data as
Right.
opposed to quantitative. But I do
Right.
think there's a purpose for both quantitative and qualitative data in deciding how we are going to improve our teaching craft and our school performance.
I personally think qualitative data is one of the most underutilized sources of data that we have, most under systematically acquired and addressed. Because in schools, leaders and teachers are looking at qualitative data, but we don't necessarily systematically acquire it and then use it.
So let's talk about that because you
Hmm.
opened
Yep.
up a great doorway for me to ask this following question. What does systemic use of data look like to develop our strategic improvement plans? Could you
Mhm.
give our school leaders some very basic tips?
I would start with those four lenses. I'm a fan of chart paper. I think it's first important to identify what sources are available to us. There's no sense trying to get data on something that's not even available to us. So let's start there with figuring out what do we have available and put in your office wall or conference room wall before big chart papers and just brainstorm with your school improvement or your leadership team. What data sources do we have available to us? And let's just write them down on the chart paper. Achievement data we have available to our HCT scores, the freshman failure rates, the end of course exams, the state test, the DIBELS or the Ames Web or whatever. And we just go through that process for those four different lenses. And then I think from there saying, okay, maybe there's no data, comprehensive look at data previously. Let's just start from scratch. Then let's go through and say, okay, so what's maybe two or three sources of data on each of these through each of these lenses that would be most helpful and interesting to us to help inform our next steps. And let's just narrow it down. And maybe three is too many. It might be one or two. Maybe on your achievement, you've got three sources, but maybe on some of the others, there's only one or two. But let's really narrow the focus because we know that when we try to do everything, we end up doing nothing. Let's get it narrowed down to a small number of things, and then let's go after those. And I'm a fan of creating some kind of a dashboard, like in an Excel spreadsheet, where we've got a one-stop shop and we go to this one place and this is where all of our data that we're really interested in tracking resides and go from there.
I would add one thing. As you were talking, Chad, I also thought about, and I'd love your take on this, in addition to identifying the data you have for the four areas, we also look at stakeholders. Parent data, I would think, would be very important for
Mm-hmm.
perception
Mm-hmm.
as well as demographic data. The parents can
Mm-hmm.
tell us so much about
Yep.
the students that we have in our classrooms. And as you were talking, I was thinking back to an episode with a mutual colleague of ours, Ari Gerzon Kessler, who was also talking about how in running parent teacher teams, PLC teams, he was able to uncover that the teachers in his school district really felt that they would benefit more from communication from teachers via text. And if the district could utilize software that allowed translation of those texts. And he
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
really mentioning that having that qualitative data about what parents wanted and needed has improved those relationships and ultimately has improved instruction because teachers have a better sense of the students that they're serving.
I love that, thinking through that lens of different stakeholders. And I also think it's important, as you were talking there, it reminded me of how sometimes we overlook the forest for the trees.
I guess, is this what you're saying? We get bogged down by the details rather than the ultimate aim?
Yes, we major in the minors. In all of the process of looking at data, the data is not the end. The data is the means to the end. The end is improved practice, that we as the adults are getting better at our work, which then impacts kids. And so I think that's also important. Looking at this data, don't get bogged in the data becoming an end to it in and of itself. It's a tool, it's the means to help us to that end. And the end is us getting better at our craft, that we are reaching more and more kids, getting higher and higher levels of learning every year.
Exactly. And speaking about those means, in terms of using data as a means to an end, what are data or data review practices that every school should be engaging in? I know there are many, but can you give me two or three that you coach your school clients that they all have to have in terms of how to look at data?
The first thing is it's before you get to the data. It's kind of like the saying of garbage in, garbage out. If what we've got coming in from the data is garbage, the decisions we make is going to be garbage. And one of the most important practices that I find in schools is the data, and I'm talking the day-to-day really specific. We got to get specific down to kids. Who are the kids by skill, by name? By name and by need, as sometimes some people will say, name of kids and what's their specific need. So like I mentioned earlier, is it adding 2 digits, 3 digits? Is it with a number line? Is it regrouping? Is it with the standard algorithm? Is it with the box method? We got to get really specific. And what that means is that a practice that has to go away is averages.
Averages mask the details.
They do. And many times people say, but Chad, this is how we've always done it. Yes, it is how we've always done it. And that doesn't make it right. If I had 2 buckets of water in front of me and one was freezing, it was 30 degrees, and I had another bucket of water and it was just about boiling, 200 degrees, and I put my 2 hands in, one hand in one bucket and one in the other, on average, I should be comfortable. In reality, I'm neither. And that's what averages do. Before we even look at data, we got to make sure that the data is set up right. So looking at, on average, this number of kids, or on average, this average score on this test was, or those have to go away. Instead, we got to get by student, by skill. How are kids doing on each skill? And not look at average. 86% of my kids got adding 2-digit numbers with regrouping. 82% of my kids got adding with 3-digit numbers. 65% got the 4-digit with regrouping. And so I got to focus on, for some reason, they're not making that transfer. And so I'm looking at by skill and by student, not just, well, on average, if you looked at that on average, 70% of kids are getting it. Yeah, that doesn't help us.
Because it is about meeting the students where the students are at. And if some of your students aren't getting whatever skill it is that they should be getting, again, how are we as educators scaffolding the learning so they can meet that standard? And then conversely, though, how are we ensuring that students who have met that standard aren't waiting around for the students that haven't met it to meet it? Because then their growth is going to slow. And so that's not serving their need. If we're a school community, and many schools, and you know this, Chad, will have portrait of graduates, vision statements, mission statements, and almost every school talks about, we care about the success of all of our children. But if you are just looking at the averages, then you're not caring about all your students. You do have to look at the details. Like you said, look at the name and look at their strength areas and the opportunities for growth. Now that's academically. I could even point to an example in terms of culture. I work here in New Jersey, Chad, with an organization called the School Culture and Climate Initiative. And we conduct surveys in school communities about, to your point about perception data, how do we think we're doing? And it's very interesting sometimes how different stakeholders align in their perceptions, and also when they think they're going to align and they actually don't align. And one area that we're seeing this play out is when we look at individual subgroups of student populations, where overall students might value their school and feel good about being students in that school. But there have been cases where some of the communities in which we've done these surveys, students who are LGBTQ do not feel that way. Or students who are diverse don't feel that way. Again, knowing your individual students, unmasking those averages and focusing on the detail, that's
Mhm.
important. Because again,
Yep,
if you say you're a school that cares for all students, then that also includes the students on the edges or on the margins.
absolutely. All means all. And in the district I was in for central office for almost a decade, we started to use the word all when we were setting goals and said, you know what? All is too easy to say. Each. We use the word each instead. And I think that just has a little bit of just a small, little, subtle connotative difference in improving the learning of each student is just a little bit, has a little different feel to it than improving the learning of all students.
It does. It puts that emphasis on the individual. Now, we've talked a lot about data in a very brief amount of time. What are two or three things that we haven't mentioned about using data in school improvement work that you think we should mention?
We've kind of hit on these ideas, but I'll maybe just re-emphasize them. And that is that number one, it's not the end in of itself. Data is a tool, it's a means to improve practice. That the end is improved practice. That's what we want. And then the impact, of course, is on students, because we know that when adults learn more, students learn more. So that would be the first thing. The next thing I guess I would just emphasize is the power of that real-time day-to-day data and almost demystifying with each other what is data. But not just then going, sometimes in education or maybe in life, we'd like to go on extremes and we have these pendulum swings or dichotomy. It's either all data or no data. And we need to be intentional about the data that we're looking at and tracking. And so thinking about the day-to-day real-time data that we're going after, that we're intentional about that and not just saying, oh yeah, well, everything's data. Everything is data, yes. And what are we going to be really intentional about?
I'm really glad you mentioned intentional. This gets to something we were talking about before, about the fear in using data as
Mhm.
educators. I think many of us go into education because we love it, we want to help improve lives, and we
Yeah.
see ourselves more as nurturers rather than scientists.
Mhm.
Reality, we need to be both nurturers
Yep.
and scientists. There is this fear of data, or to the point that your
Yep.
colleague made, diarrhea of data, right? And that's,
Data.
I can't even pronounce it, so I'm glad you did. But that's telling. That's
Yeah.
telling that people are overwhelmed by the amount of data that they're getting, and they're not seeing it as the helpful tool that it can be. I'm glad you mentioned, like I said, intentional, because I think if people are intentional, and getting back to what we were talking about before, knowing the questions you want to answer through data,
Mhm.
it can make data more approachable.
Absolutely.
So, Chad, before we conclude, can you describe a client engagement that you've had where they sought your counsel because they really didn't know how to use data, and then after working with you, really saw success in the data review process?
Most client engagements that I work with people over a period of time, we're looking at data and setting things up. And really, it starts for me with asking questions about what they're interested, the questions like we've been talking about throughout this whole time, like what are you interested in? And then with me also then sharing tidbits about the research says we should be tracking. With the work of teacher teams, what should we be looking at? And Rick DeFore and Becky DeFore and Bob Aker identified 18 critical issues that teams should be doing in order to become effective at improving their practice and results for students. I also share tidbits and then work with them to put together a dashboard because I really think that is important. If we have data here and data there and data everywhere, we're not focused. And so let's get ourselves organized into one succinct place where we're able to then track and monitor the improvement efforts in real time as we're going.
And what would be some of those critical issues to be looking
Mhm.
at as a team?
The critical issues involve teams identifying and regularly revisiting their norms, identifying essential content for students to learn, identifying what's not essential, and then not worrying about that, eliminating content, creating end of unit assessments, creating formative assessments, setting proficiency levels for both of those, having systematic responses to intervention, reflecting on the results to look at their own practice. Those are some of the critical issues that are on that those 18 lists.
Indeed. And again, by knowing that those are the critical issues, then to your example before about using a whiteboard and looking at the 4 domains of data, you could look at what specific data sets are going to help you to meet those critical issues. So I'm glad that you talked about that, Chad. Chad, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Absolutely. So my Twitter handle is just at Chad Dumas, ChadDumas. But then I also have a LinkedIn page and Facebook and a website, which is nextlearningsolutions.com. I've got a tiny URL, and the tinyurl.com/put the C in PLC is the tag on the tiny URL. Put the C in PLC, and that'll get folks to my website and some things around my book and such.
Wonderful. Chad, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.